Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much, Mr. Wray, and to your family and friends who have joined you here today. You said a few words about Mr. Comey, whom you have extensive experience working with in the Department of Justice. I believe you've characterized him as a terrific lawyer, public servant, and colleague. So I'd like to ask you, we are in an unusual moment in American history where Mr. Comey was fired from his job and characterized by the President of the United States as a nut job, and was fired for the stated reason by the President because the Russian investigation was underway and the President believed it was a cloud on his presidency. Mr. Comey told us a little bit about his direct dealings with the President of the United States. Two things really stood out, which I think may be fairly unique in the history of the United States. He said on one hand that he, having been caught alone in the Oval Office with the President of the United States, spoke to the Attorney General and said, "I don't want that to happen again. I want a witness when I'm meeting with the President of the United States." That is an extraordinary statement by the head of the FBI. If you were asked to meet privately with no one else with the President of the United States as director of the FBI, what would be your approach?
My first step would be to call Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein. There's a policy that applies to contacts between the White House and the department. It goes in both directions. In particular, goes to any contact between, with respect to a particular case. There obviously are situations where the FBI director needs to be able to communicate with the president on national security matters, for example. But in my experience, it would be very unusual for there to be any kind of one-on-one meeting between the FBI, any FBI director and any president.
Unusual, but it happened. And it happened to Mr. Comey, and he decided that he was uncomfortable being in the Oval Office alone with the president. So, as unusual as it may be, would you meet in the Oval Office with the president with no one else present?
I think it would depend on the circumstances, Senator. I think it would be highly unlikely, but I think I could imagine a situation where there would be some national security matter where they might call for it. But I would, again, my preference and my presumption would be that there should be people from the department often working through the Office of the Deputy Attorney General, so that it's not a one-on-one meeting. I think the relationship between any FBI director and any president needs to be a professional one, not a social one. And there certainly shouldn't be any discussion one-on-one discussion between the FBI director and any president about how to conduct particular investigations or cases.
Now, the second thing, which I think is extraordinary, and I don't know if there's any precedent in the history of the United States since the creation of the FBI, was Mr. Comey's decision, after meeting with the president and discussions with the president, to create a contemporaneous written record. You know, as an attorney with the Department of Justice, that has evidentiary value. Tell me your reaction. Do you feel bound, or at least do you feel the recommendation from Comey's action to create contemporary written records of your conversations with the president if you become director of the FBI?
Well, Senator, I think at a minimum, I would take the approach that I always do to talking to people, which is to try to listen very carefully to what I'm hearing in the conversation. And there could be times where I would think that the appropriate next step is for me to memorialize that, but I would evaluate that on a case-by-case basis.
There's much, you can correct me because I think you have much more experience in this area. Your memory of a conversation and a written contemporaneous report carry different evidentiary value and weight in a courtroom. Is that not true?
That's absolutely true.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you're saying is under some circumstances, conversations with the President of the United States you feel should be memorialized in a contemporaneous written report.
Certainly there would be situations where it would be appropriate for me to memorialize the conversation, just like there would be with other people if they were important conversations that I thought it made sense.
I'm not going to let you off that easy.
Okay.
Of course, that is your responsibility as director. But we're dealing with an extraordinary situation here, where a man you respected was fired, called a nut job, and the president said to Russian visitors, "We're putting an end to this investigation." This is not an ordinary course of business for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This is the highest elected official in the United States of America trying to stop an investigation by putting Jim Comey out of business. I think it's a little different than the routine requirements of the office. Do you?
Well, certainly I would distinguish, Senator, if this is what you're driving at, between a sort of routine conversation and a very significant, important conversation. And ones that fall in the latter category, I would think it would behoove me to make sure there's an appropriate record of that.
We've talked a lot about Russia in this hearing and the threat to the United States. You've read the unclassified version of their attempt to have a cyber attack on the United States election campaign. Now we have a statement from the President of the United States suggesting, quote, Putin and I discussed forming an impenetrable cybersecurity unit so that election hacking and many other negative things will be guarded and safe. So now we've all started with the premise that Russia was involved in trying to change our election. We all understand that Russia has been a bad actor around the world in many places. And now we have the president saying, we're going to get together with them on the issue of cybersecurity. So if it is proposed to you by the administration to create this cybersecurity unit and to share information with the Russians about the United States capabilities and vulnerabilities when it comes to cybersecurity, what is your reaction?
Well, my reaction, Senator, is that I need to learn a lot more about the current state of our cybersecurity defenses and our threats in talking to the career intelligence community professionals to be able to evaluate that responsibly. But I wouldn't want to do anything that, if I got that kind of advice and input, suggested was putting us at greater risk as opposed to greater protection.
I would think there would be red flags flying in every direction. I guess that's a bad analogy with Russia. But I think there should be a cautionary feeling about any suggestion that we give to them information about our cyber capabilities and security. Wouldn't that be your first reaction?
Well, Senator, my reaction is that any threat, any effort to interfere with our election systems is one, whether it's from a state actor like Russia or from a non-state actor, is something that needs to be taken very seriously. And I would think that it would be wise for all of us to proceed with great caution in the wake of that information.
I think I'd go further, but I'll leave that question. You and I had a good conversation yesterday about President George W. Bush's reaction after 9/11 when it came to the Muslim American population of the United States. I would appreciate it if you would recount your impression of the president's conduct after 9/11 when it came to this topic, and your own personal feelings about the patriotism of Muslim Americans and the role they play in keeping America safe.
Thank you, Senator. It is something that we talked about yesterday. And first off, let me say, I think the FBI director needs to be an FBI director for all Americans. Second, the conversation that you're referring to, one of the things that I remember being struck by President Bush in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, when the dust had barely settled, was that he took great pains to speak. I can't remember if he spoke at a mosque or what, but I remember that he made a special point of speaking out and saying that that this was not a situation where we, in the war on terror, were at war with Muslim Americans. And he made an outreach to the community at a time when it would not have been by any measure politically expedient to do that. And I remember thinking at the time that that was a remarkably courageous and noble gesture on his part, and I admired him for doing that, especially at that time in that environment.
So I said to you, it is my impression meeting with Muslim Americans in my state, families and individuals, they are in the same state of mind today as Japanese Americans were during World War II, when many were headed to internment camps for security purposes. What can you say on the record now, if you are chosen as director of the FBI, about your relationship working with patriotic, God-fearing, lawful Muslim Americans in our nation?
Senator, I would say sort of what I was saying just a minute ago, which is I think the FBI director and the FBI needs to be the FBI and the FBI director for all Americans, including Muslim Americans. And my experience in terrorism investigations has been that some of the best leads we ever got were from members of that community, from Muslim Americans. And I remember having conversations with among others, U.S. Attorney from your state, Pat Fitzgerald, a friend of mine. And so while certainly we do face threats from certain radical ideologies when turned to violence, it is also true that those Americans, just like all Americans, are people that we need to get information from to help protect the homeland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.